Hi, I'm Jerome Yoskovitz, and today we're going to talk about low-till and no-till farming. No-till farming is useful anywhere, and it has its purpose no matter what climate or zone you're in. So, in certain areas, such as dry areas, no-till farming is great for creating organic matter and holding water. I farmed in Southern California, San Diego area, in East San Diego County, where it's really hot and dry. And what I did was create what was called a hugelkultur. And a hugelkultur is usually a mound of sticks and organic matter buried in soil and compost, and it'll heat itself up and reduce, and then you plant in it. Now, I did a similar thing, except I inverted it. Everything in dry areas is the exact opposite of wet areas. So, in a dry area, you're going to want more of a basin to plant in. So I dug large trenches about 32 inches wide and as long as the row, and I buried organic matter. I took people's yard waste on the street, and I would bury this in these long trenches, which would eventually become my farming rows, my garden rows. And so I buried this organic matter, and then I filled it in with what some of the native soil, and then I'd have mushroom compost, vegetable compost, and sometimes manure compost. And when all those things sat and burned, it would be a mound at first, but then it would sink down to almost soil level. Mine were a little high, but to almost soil level. And once you had this built, that organic matter will slowly be breaking down, which will be feeding microorganisms in the soil. Added with a certain principle, when you harvest this crop, excuse me, when you harvest this crop, you're going to cut the crop and you're going to leave the root in the ground. A good example of this is a farm called Singing Frogs Farm, and they're in Sebastopol, California. And they do this technique. They're vegetable growers, and they'll harvest, say, a lettuce plant, but they'll cut it and they'll leave the root in the soil. And leaving that root in the soil is adding organic matter for microorganisms to feed on. And when they eat these roots, they excrete what they eat, and that's plant available nutrient for the next plant. The roots will go down and catch those nutrients, and they'll have something to eat. So that's its use in a dry climate. It's to add organic matter and hold water. The more you leave those roots in the ground, the more organic matter you have in the ground, the more you're unlocking nutrients. Organic matter has a way of unlocking nutrients in really heavy clay soils or dry soils. So all that organic matter and then no-till, meaning you harvest and you leave the crop residue in the ground. Then you can cover it with more compost. You always want to add organic matter. Anytime anyone asks a question about something someone can't solve as far as in soil science, they'll usually tell you just add organic matter, add compost. And they're right. Adding organic matter feeds microorganisms, and that's what we want. We want to feed the soil, and that's what no-till or low-till farming does. Now, low-till farming would be something like a broad fork, something with minimal disturbance. Or I think there's I don't remember the name of the machine, but it'll only turn like the top inch of the soil or something like that. You want minimal disturbance in a low-till system. Sometimes you use a broad fork in the beginning to soften the soil. You're pulling a broad fork. You're digging into the ground. You're pulling it back. You're going into the soil and moving it. You're going into the soil and moving it with the forks, and you're doing that to aerate the soil and semi-till it. Um, but this is only necessary for a little while. Over time, within a season or two, you're just going to be throwing compost on there. It's just a matter of giving organic matter because it'll start to aerate itself. Soil has pores. We have earthworms that swim throughout or move throughout the soil and create pores for the water to filtrate down. Now, in a wet system, a good example of in a wet system is, say, the tropical rainforest. In a tropical rainforest, the soil is actually nutrient poor. There is nutrients in the tropical soil from old rocks and old organic matter that has decayed, but in a tropical system or a heavy rain system, it's going to leach. It's going to leach those nutrients out. It flushes. If you look at plants in a jungle, they're very robust. They're very full. They're very lush. And in a jungle or a rainforest, the reason that is because the plants store the nutrients within themselves and in their bodies, because they're not getting it from the soil like they could. in a dryer system. So that being said, if say you're growing in the tropics, and you grow vegetables, it's almost necessary that you do no-till and harvest, leaving that organic matter in the soil, because it's just an extra boost of nutrients for those roots to eat, because they're not going to get it but from decayed rocks and old decayed organic matter. So the more organic matter you can add, the better. Now, when people talk about wet soil or tropical soils and say they're going to clear a forest and they're going to plant things like corn, and I think this is what they do in the rainforest, is they're clearing certain areas and they're planting corn and soy and things like that to feed the world. But when you're doing this, the second you cut out those crops, you're cutting out the nutrition, because those crops live off of old nutrients that were there before. So if you cut those crops out, you just cut all the nutrients out. They were the nutrient. So if you were to cut that crop out and leave the root, you're good, but you got to keep doing that. It's basically inert. Once you cut out those old crops, the indigenous crops, there's nothing in that soil, and that's why they spray the chemicals and the fertilizers. It's almost like it's necessary at that point, but it can be avoided. So in a wet system, I would really enjoy seeing a no-till way of farming, where you leave the organic matter in the ground and then cover with compost after you've harvested. I just want to talk about those two things, and if you like my videos, please subscribe or hit like, and thank you for your time.